Perfect. Right. Well, following on from looking at usage impact, I'm going to be looking at the relationship between dissemination and impact. And dissemination may not be impact in itself, but obviously without dissemination, you're a bit limited in terms of the impact that you can have. So looking at dissemination effectiveness, I think, is going to be really important. So this is something that is very close to my heart because I'm the Executive Director of Kudos, and we are a service that helps facilitate authors sharing information about their publications with the opportunity for them to do that in partnership with their publishers. So I'll be drawing on my experience of that in my presentation today. First of all, let's just remind ourselves that there's nothing fundamentally new about authors sharing their publications. They've been doing it for years. They've been photocopying, they've been sent off prints. For those of you that can remember the days of looking at people giving their print copies to the library, I can remember looking at that too back in my OUP days. So it's long been part of career progression for researchers to want to make sure that their peers are seeing their content and that's being shared effectively. Obviously the difference today is the scale that they're able to do that on in the digital environment. And if we want to take a look at that scale, all we need to do is look at some of the big scholarly collaboration networks to get a size, an idea, the vast size of the audiences and the volume of documents available on these sites. So this is just a snapshot of ResearchGate, academia.edu and Mendeley, and just to give you a kind of comparative scale on that, PubMed has something like 27 million citations, and ResearchGate now say they have 100 million plus documents, Mendeley 500 million plus documents. So that's a vast audience, and as a researcher you can see just how incredibly attractive that must be in terms of giving visibility to your work. So we were sort of curious about this at Kudos to find out a little bit more, and particularly to understand how the content gets there. We ran a survey recently in partnership with 10 publishers to look at attitudes and practices of authors relating to sharing, particularly using the big scholarly collaboration networks. And these were some of the headline findings. The way the content is getting there is authors are putting it there. 57% of respondents were regularly uploading content to these networks, and their marketing savviness is incredibly strong. For anybody else here who's registered with ResearchGate, at every turn you are prompted to upload your next article. So not surprisingly then, 84% say this is very easy to do, and the formats that they're choosing are PDF, and the article is a very nice handy format to load to these networks. And then the other thing that perhaps came as a little bit more of a surprise was we asked what the main reason was that people were using these networks. And the majority, 66%, said their main reason was for accessing content. And why that attracted my attention was that Nature asked a similar question just 3 years ago. And the main reason people were using these sites then was for networking and being personally visible. But in 3 years' time, now it's for accessing content. And when Nature asked the question, 33% of researchers were using these sites to access content. That is a big change in just 3 years, and not surprising when you see how much content is there. So I call this kind of dissemination passive sharing. From an author's perspective, they're really simply showcasing their work. They're making sure it can be discovered by their peers. But I think the big unknown for publishers is how much of your content is on these sites, how it's being used, and the onward impact of that. And this is really, I think, critically lost intelligence for publishers. Obviously, there's a concern around business models too, if you've got non-OA content. But I think that loss of information about usage and the impact is just as important. It's also potentially quite confusing for authors who are using several of these networks, uploading their content. They may have some statistics available to them on each of these sites, but they're not comparable, they're not counter-compliant, all those things that we value. So one of the first jobs to be done, and it's something we're working on at Kudos at the moment in an initiative called the Fair Share Network, is how can we start recapturing some of that story, understanding that data, how these documents are being used and to what effect. Because really that's the starting point for any of us in being able to understand what the value of dissemination is, and also the relative effectiveness of different kinds of sharing activities and platforms. There's another kind of dissemination that I call active sharing. This is where researchers send information more directly to colleagues through email or by social media, and it's really encouraging to hear Tybalt talk about the fact that this is becoming part of his workflow now. Publishing is the start of impact, not the end, and he's actively working to make sure his work is disseminated, and interestingly outside of his community too. We collect data in Kudos in terms of where people are sharing, the resulting click-throughs, downloads from published sites and so on. So we're starting to get some evidence of does that kind of activity generate meaningful results. And Nanyang University did an analysis with some of our data last year and found that there was something like a 23% increase in downloads from a publisher's site when authors are actively sharing information about their work. So meaningful results do come from it. That is still a very kind of simplistic way of thinking about dissemination impact, though, usage, click-throughs and so on. I think there's a much bigger and more interesting and sophisticated story that we need to be working towards. And I tend to think about metrics in this world divided into three categories. The first being reach. This is really an indicator of how far your information can travel. It's a measure of popularity. It can be measured by things like network size, views, visitors, that kind of data. Interestingly enough, ResearchGate have recently introduced a reach score, so you can get an idea of the size of the audience that your work is getting to. So this is obviously not an indicator of impact in itself, but it is certainly the start of impact. The bigger your network, the more eyeballs that you can get to see your work, the more likely you are going to attract attention and then have a meaningful outcome, citation or usage as a result of that. The second bunch of metrics that I think of when I think of dissemination is resonance. These are attention metrics, what we often call altmetrics. This is indications of likes and mentions. It's activity around your work. Again, I don't really see this as an impact measure, but I see it as an opportunity for impact measure. So this is a way that an author can be alerted to activity that they can build on, or their publisher can build on, or their university can build on to create more meaningful impact, which I call relevance. So this is the things we're more familiar with. That dissemination activity has led to a download or a citation or a reference in a policy document or practical application, those kind of things. And I think if we take those three things together and combine them, reach, resonance, and relevance, we begin to have a much more powerful and nuanced way of looking at dissemination and research impact. So finally, just on this sort of topic of dissemination, primarily we're talking about the article. I'm talking about the article here, but what gets me excited as a marketeer is that there's all sorts of different ways that we can disseminate research. I mean, the article has done an amazing job since 1665, but I guess we have to say in the 21st century, is this the best way for us to communicate this very complex technical information to the very broad audiences, interdisciplinary audiences, public audiences that we now have an opportunity to engage with? And when you think about the videos and infographics and beginnings of the evidence around how powerful some of those content assets, if you want the marketing terminology, are, but if we can bring some of that thinking into the academic world, then I'm really kind of excited about what we can do for the dissemination of research. We had the beginnings of some understanding of this at Kudos, because one of the things we facilitate is linking together a whole bunch of related resources to an article, and we're beginning to look at tracking the interrelationship between those pieces of content and resulting activity on the publisher's site. So there's a lot of amazing data there, and really sort of interesting things for us to explore in terms of our role as publishers in disseminating information, which is a much bigger story than just the article. So thank you very much.